Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cash Up, a weekly show where we converse with amazing folks in digital forensics and incident response. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by Jamie Levy. Jamie's an experienced researcher, developer, author, and forensic examiner. Currently, she's the director of the EDR team for Tanium. She's also a senior researcher and developer for the Volatility Foundation, a core developer of the Volatility Project, a Black Hats event trainer, and a trainer for memory analysis. Prior to her current roles, Jamie worked as a senior security researcher for SecureWorks, a manager in threat intelligence for Terramark, a consultant writing custom end scripts for guidance software, and taught classes in computer forensics and computer science at City University of New York, or CUNY, John Jay Colleges, and CUNY Queens College. Jamie earned her Master of Science in Forensic Computing from CUNY John Jay College of Criminal Justice and her BA from CUNY Hunter College. In addition, she has done coursework at both CUNY Graduate Center and Tel Aviv University. Jamie is an accomplished peer-reviewed author, probably best known as one of the co-authors of The Art of Memory Forensics, as well as multiple blogs and magazine articles. You can find links to many of her articles, white papers, and presentations on her website at glida.org. She's presented her research at multiple conferences, including Black Hat, the Open Source Digital Forensics Conference, or OSDFCon, the High Tech Crime Investigation Association, or HTCIA, NFUSE, the Computer Enterprise Investigators Conference, or CEIC, the IEEE International Conference of Communications, or the IEEEICC, and the Open Memory Forensics Workshop, OMFW, and more, on a variety of topics, including malware analysis, network, and memory forensics. Jamie regularly gives back to the community as both a member of the board of directors for the Volatility Foundation and a member of the programming committees for various conferences, including DFRWS, B-Sides NYC, and more. Jamie's technical prowess, presentations, and trainings are incredible. If you have the opportunity to take a workshop or class from her, you should. I'm so happy to get to speak with someone who I have complete admiration for. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Jamie Levy. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. You've done so much. You've shown so much technical acumen. You've trained so many people to understand not only the basics, but the deep work in memory forensics. How did you get here?
Well, it's kind of an interesting journey, I guess. When I was an undergraduate, I was taking a class in neural networks, and I was also
Different
at the
memory.
time, yeah, yeah. And I was also like pretty fascinated with all these different like crime, like true crime kind of shows, like Forensic Files and whatever. And one of the things that we had to do for our final project was to find a piece of software that was out in the real world and try to either describe it or, make a model of it. And so I'd heard about this one particular software called Catch, which was computer-aided tracking and characterization of homicides. And what it did was it used neural networks to try to cluster together these self-organizing maps, actually, to cluster together different types of murders so that they could find patterns and see whether or not there were serial killers that were over state lines and whatnot. And so I was really fascinated by it. I managed to contact the people that had created the software, and I asked them if there was anything, that they could give me just to have a better understanding about it. Obviously, they didn't have a copy of it that they could share because this was
Right.
law enforcement only. But they were kind enough to give me some presentations and some white papers and things that they had put together in order to get more of an idea of how it worked. And so what I did was I built something that worked similar to this, where you could just kind of put in these different characteristics and it would just kind of cluster it and give you like this very crude looking map of how these things cluster together. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And so, I mean, I was studying computer science at the time, and I was like, maybe there's something I can do like more on the forensic-y kind of side of it. But there weren't any programs at the time.
Right.
So eventually I went in to do my PhD. I was in a PhD program. I didn't finish. I was more interested at the time in artificial intelligence and robotics and stuff, and that was what I was focusing on. But then there was a master's program that started up in forensic computing at John Jay College while I was there doing my PhD. And I said, you know what? I've always had this kind of draw towards this forensic-y side, so I decided to go and do that program instead. So I left the PhD program, went and did my master's, and I just fell in love with it. There was so much to learn at the time. It was a new field. There weren't like a lot of books about computer forensics, and I just really got into it. I did. So once I was there, one of my graduate thesis or whatever that I did was actually on memory encryption. So the idea was where we would try to hide things like the passwords and other things that the applications have to keep track of in memory, and just kind of obfuscate it very easily with like some encryption algorithm, and that way we couldn't just scan memory for it at the time. And so that's how I kind of got into the memory part of it. And another thing that we were also doing was we were creating a sandbox. We called it like a malware jig or something. I don't think sandboxes were really like around at the time.
I like malware jig.
Yeah. And so the idea was like, we were trying to, have these virtual machines, and you run something on it, and then you do like a difference, what happened on the disk and what happened on the memory. And so for the memory part, we were trying to figure out how we could actually see the differences. And at the time, the only thing that was freely available was a program called PT Finder, which was written by Andreas Schuster. And it was right before Volatools was being mentioned and released at Black Hat. And so we were using PT Finder for this. And then once Volatools came out, which was Aaron's tool, I managed to figure out how to contact Aaron through IRC. And I started asking him all these questions about it. And I think he gave me a copy of it, and we were able to use it with this malware jig. And then shortly after, Volatility was released. And so I was like really, trying to get involved with that. And I was just constantly on IRC, like bugging Aaron and Moix, Brendan Dolan Gavitt, who was on there at the time, and a few others. But that's kind of how, that was the main trajectory into what I do.
You made your path there because you found something you loved, and you found ways to tie something you were skilled at with your comp sci background with something that you just thought was amazing and fun. You tied it together, and then you pushed and reached out. You pushed and reached out to Aaron Walters, and you were like asking questions, and then you're like, I want to be involved with this. And then it came to fruition. And I love that passion that really brought you there. I think John Jay College is really an interesting place for you to have a background because they have such a strong criminology department. You'll meet lots of law enforcement professionals, not on the IR side, but more on the law enforcement side, who did criminology, criminal science degrees at John Jay. And it was one of the first schools to bring in a master's of forensic science. And it made sense because they had a strong computer science department and a really strong criminology department. So I love how they did that. Was that program very heavy almost on the criminal justice or law enforcement perspective because of that, or not really?
Well, we did have to take a lot of classes in criminology in addition to the technical courses as well. And actually, I found those courses very interesting because I didn't know really anything about that side.
Right. It's completely different, right?
Yeah, and just having to, like, I remember there were some classes that we took, where you're actually like studying like the judicial statements, and you're looking at this and you're like going through that, and what did they really mean whenever they wrote this, or this decision? What does this decision really mean? And it was just crazy. It was like a whole other way of thinking about things that I had never done before. And I love that. So it was interesting. I actually liked those classes.
And that's kind of neat about that program. It gives you that different perspective because,
Hmm.
most other programs are just very heavy in digital forensics technical courses. So I think that's kind of cool that you got that exposure. That's a little bit different. How neat.
Yeah, yeah, I enjoyed my time there, and even I tried to learn a lot of things like outside of whatever we were doing. It just more like sparked an interest in me. Like there wasn't really, I mean, any like memory forensic stuff. I mean, this was
No,
just,
no, I mean,
Aaron was like pushing the way forward for that, and it was all very new. And
the
yeah, you
work
just,
that you all did is the foundation. I find it actually funny sometimes when people say, volatility foundation, because technically it's a foundation, but volatility is also the foundation, and that work is the foundation. And your book in the art of memory forensics that you co-authored is the foundation of what has become this field and this immersion of memory forensics. So
mhm.
it's kind of neat. So bringing you today, what kinds of things are you working on now?
So, one of the things that I'm hoping to release sometime this year is a profiling library. I had written this originally to work with Volatility 2 and never released it. I've rewritten it to work with Volatility 3, but also it can work with other types of, it's open enough where you can actually use it with any type of software as long as you just point or pull in this library and just kind of give it the information that you want to contain within these containers. So I don't remember, I mean, I don't know if you are familiar with the profiling work that I've done before, but I've done talks on it where you're using set mechanisms in order to very quickly figure out differences and similarities between sets of data. And on top of this profiling library, I have also built another library that I hope to release that allows you to very quickly find similarities between various incidents. So you can see whether or not there are different attacks that are similar enough um, and be able to figure out whether or not they're related. Because a lot of times you have attackers that use the same kind of tools, the same kind of methodologies. You'll see the same processes and artifacts that are created. And so I tried to make a way where you could kind of figure out how similar they are to each other and whether or not they might be related.
Jamie, I love this. So, my brain's going a million miles a minute with different applications for this that come from my experience. So, I've spent a lot of
Mhm.
time in mobile. And two of the ways that I would love to see this applied are one, characterizing threat actors based on their usage of applications.
Mhm.
So, different TTPs and different organizations, different threat actors use different apps for their communication, et cetera, so that you could quickly take the file system image of a phone, using this profiler, and determine which threat groups their TTPs are similar to based on application usage.
Mhm.
And then secondarily, and actually I was talking with Alexis Brignoni yesterday for a volunteer project we're doing specifically in this realm, but for foreign travel and actually looking at the system and firmware on mobile devices when folks travel to places and they want to make sure that their device was not compromised overseas. We don't actually care about the application content. We care about changes to system files, et cetera, based on golden images. And a lot of that work um, is in the weeds because, of course, systems update and, of course, programs update. So you have to do a lot of comparatives, but being able to profile based off of knowns to compare to those would be a huge time saver and help you get to those things more quickly. So I think that this has, especially if you made it open enough that the concept can be applied in different ways, I think that
Mhm.
could be really cool.
Yeah, I wanted it to be something that you could use with other types of software outside of volatility. I mean, obviously it started
Right.
as like a memory
And,
type
and it
thing because
makes absolutely necessary that in that field for looking at attackers on systems. I think
yeah.
it's brilliant, but I'm always like,
But yeah, I wanted it to be like its own kind of self-contained thing that you could just kind
right,
of you could even work with it offline. Like once you have the information like saved into it, you could work with it outside of whatever this other software is that you've
cool
uh,
concept.
brought that in. So yeah, it's
I
just
look
taken me
forward
a
to it.
while. Oh, thank you.
That is really cool. And it sounds like an intense project. And it's really interesting because it brings together so many different things that you've done throughout your career, and it's got so many different places it can be applicable. And I just think that's really a neat project. That's
Well, thank
really
you.
cool.
Yeah, I'm
That's
looking forward to releasing it finally.
and you mentioned Volatility 3.
Mhm.
And so for maybe people who aren't familiar and are still using the Volatility 2 framework, did you want to share anything about Volatility 3?
Yes, we're supposed to have a release sometime fairly soon this year, and but you can definitely pull it down from GitHub now
I've
in its current
I've played
state,
with it.
play with it. The really cool thing is you don't have to specify profiles. It just figures that out on the fly. So that's good. And it's so much quicker. It's like it's been a complete rewrite. There were a lot of things that were kind of redundant, what we did in Volatility 2, and didn't realize it and until Mike Audie kind of looked at some of these things, especially like with the registry stuff, like why it was so slow. And the rewrite has allowed it to be so much faster. It works so much better. And uh, it's just going to be awesome. I mean, like we're
It's
still
really cool.
converting over some of the plugins, so it doesn't have all of the functionality that we have
Right.
for Volatility 2, but definitely it's underway. We have interns that have been hired to help with this also, and it seems actually that a lot more people have gotten involved with the project. Like there are lots of people doing the conversions and everything. So it's really awesome to see the
So we
community come out.
we just did a weekly CTF for 3 months, and we used a different forensic image for 3 months. And the last month in December, we did a memory image. So the whole community was looking at it, and I played with Volatility 3 on that and compared some things. And there were things that I couldn't do in 3 yet, or I didn't know how to do in 3 yet, but I think were plugin related that I went back to 2.4, and it's like when you sometimes put the training wheels back on, like I played a little bit of that because I was like, I know what the plugin is, and so, but I don't remember specifically which plugins, but there's a couple of good write-ups from people who were doing that where they did
Hmm.
exercises they solved the challenge and they did it in Vol 2 and Vol 3 and showed both sets of commands in some of the write-ups. So it was kind of cool to see that. Uh, and I enjoyed that. And a couple of people using memproc.fs, which if you haven't used
Hmm.
that, it just mounts the memory as a file system. So it's very different. You're not going to, run a user assist plugin in there, but it's pretty cool just seeing the different ways that people solve the different memory challenges.
Hmm.
Um, so I've enjoyed that the last month.
Yeah, there's many different ways to go about solving the same problem, and it's
Yes,
interesting to see all the different ways because sometimes it helps highlight things that maybe you want to use in your next investigations because you're like, oh, well, I didn't think I could get to that same information this other way. Um, but yeah,
and
I like to see that too.
like I think it's really cool when you do a problem and then you see other people do that same problem or do that
Hmm.
same investigation their different ways, or like even when you're working a case and you do that like office collab and everybody throws out a different way to look for the same thing. And I think that that's something that we forget about, that the traces can be found multiple different ways. You can go multiple ways to get to the same trace, and it's just really awesome. And that's what's neat about having access to memory, is because there's so much in there, and like redumping out process memory and then reprocessing those dumps. And I
Hmm.
so much, it's good fun. Like if you're out there and you're not playing with memory, um please do, because not only is it interesting and can help you find cases and can help you solve things, it's just fun.
Yeah, and there's still so much more that you can do with it. I mean, there's tons of stuff that still research problems that still haven't been solved in that space. So there's plenty of room for everybody in that space.
Absolutely. And we have a lot of students who join us, and I encourage you. There's also not enough content, I think, in a memory space. I mean, there are people who are putting out memory research all the time, but it's an area that is still ripe. So if this is something that interests you and you're listening, great areas for you to do further research for your capstone projects, your theses, etc. And yeah, please do it and then share it. So we all need it. I love it. Profiling library is going to be really cool. And in even creating that project and all of these things that you do, where do you find your inspiration for this work?
That's kind of a hard question. I there are a lot of people that I look up to or have looked up to. George Garner, who isn't with us anymore, was somebody who I really looked up to and tried to draw some inspiration from him and had a lot of private conversations with. And I just the way he lived, I think was good. You know, the way that he pulled, you know, he had his piece of land and he farmed and he just, you know, had all that in addition to all the crazy technical stuff that he did. So I think, like, in general, just to live your life well and you know, try to get away and don't always be about the technical work. Also be about the relationships with people and finding your own inner peace as well.
That's beautiful. And I love how you draw that from somebody who you cared about and had that kind of connection with. And it's not just the technical part, it's how they live and how they lived. And I just think that's absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, no problem.
I'm so glad that you're able to find that and that inspiration that continues with you. That is a continuation of what he brought. So I just think that's beautiful and what a blessing to be able to continue that and to bring that to other people. And you're bringing that to us today. So
thank you.
I thank you so much. Is there maybe a story you could share from the type of work you've done, a case experience?
Oh, yeah. So there was kind of an interesting case that I worked once, and it kind of also tied into like my college work. So when I was at John Jay College, it was probably like around 2005 or 2006. I took a class with one of the professors there, and at the beginning of the class, he was like, he was saying, he was apologizing for basically having to take the website down for a little bit. He had gotten a phone call from somebody, I think it was somebody in law enforcement, I can't really remember who it was, that there was something on his website. It was like a comment on his website, and it apparently was part of some kind of a botnet or something like that.
Okay.
But he didn't know. He was just like, I don't understand. How could this little comment on the top of my website pages be something that's malicious? And he was just showing us this comment and everything. And I was like, well, that's really strange, you know, and you start kind of thinking about it, right? Well, years later, I was actually doing an investigation, and it was at a data center where they had one of these APT groups. The comment crew actually was going through and infecting all these different websites that they had at this data center. And so we were just basically trying to figure out, like, what were all the different comments that they were putting, where were all the different connections coming from to all these different pages, and just kind of watching everything, looking at the logs, just seeing where are they going, what are they doing. And it was really interesting because you could see, like, even where they were testing, where they would put new malware up and they would test these comments, and you would see the connections, like in the logs, like right after that. Like first you'll see, like, you know, that the file that they're trying to pull down is not there, and then you'll see, like, oh, now it's successful, and you would see the timestamps of when they put the file there, and it was just so fascinating. But one of the other things that was interesting was that they installed Emule, which was this
Oh,
peer-to-peer
yep,
software that was, pretty relevant at the time. They
yep.
installed that on, yeah, you would see it. And
You'd see it everywhere in child sexual abuse material, etc.
yeah,
Yeah.
so they had installed it on a lot of these machines, and they had all these documents that they wanted people to pull down, and they were a lot of like political, things in Asia kind of documents and whatever. And when you pulled these documents down, you would see that they were weaponized. And so it was interesting because this was, I
Okay.
guess, part of like how they were spreading. And I don't know, it was just a really
That's
fascinating
really a
case.
cool case. Yeah.
Yeah, but when we started first doing it and I was looking at these comments, I was like, oh my gosh, I remember this
And you
thing
remember
from,
this thing from having been like, well, what's doing that? How's that working? And then you
yeah,
investigate it and you see it. That's really cool when you can tie back like that to other experiences where you question. And it also shows how all the knowledge you gained
hmm
allowed you to then see those things, and it's kind of cool. When I get those clicks, sometimes it's the opposite. It's in a way that's not as um benign, because you learn something and you're like, oh, now I want to go back and look at that old case because I think that might have been there. And
hmm
that's why it's a little less benign, because you're like, oh, shoot, did I mess up that investigation? And you read the report, and luckily there was other evidence and other traces, and you came to the same conclusion, even though
hmm
you didn't look at that thing, kind of like what we were talking about multiple ways. But you're like, man, I wish I would have known this
I
on this
know.
old case, right? it's,
Well, there was nothing I could have done like when I
no,
was a
that's great.
college student
No,
because,
yeah. But
yeah.
it's just kind of cool that it clicked together to this place that was that's what I'm saying, that was benign, that was completely
Uh-huh.
innocuous. But being able to have that click and that link, that's always cool, especially when it's an interesting case like what you were
Yeah.
just talking about. That's
And it
really
shows
neat.
also how old that particular group, I mean, like they've been around for a while. This was
They've
like
been
a few
around.
years later. And then later on there was like the big report, from Mandy that came out about them and everything. So yeah, it was
It's
pretty
really cool.
interesting.
That is really, really cool. And it shows that because sometimes you don't realize how long things have been around,
hmm
uh, and how long they got to, again, how long has this technique been around and been used, and this exploit been used, because it's always, that's sometimes both interesting and a little scary, but that's
Yeah, definitely.
that's okay. So outside of doing your investigations and all of your research and development, what makes you tick outside? What gives you that oomph?
Oh, well, I love to go outdoors. And actually, I have a little farm and I have alpacas and goats and
What?
things like that. Yeah. And so I spend a lot of time doing things on the farm whenever I'm not working. Uh,
Oh, that is
yeah,
incredible.
maintaining all this over here.
That is incredible. And a big contrast. I love that you get that peace and that motivation. A big contrast, having been somebody who went to schools inside New York City.
hmm
And that is a big contrast then in your life. And I'm so glad that that gives you joy and peace. And I want to go to an alpaca farm. That sounds so
Yeah,
incredible.
well, they're such teases. Like, they look all nice and fluffy and you think that they're going to be cuddly and everything, but they aren't. They don't want you to touch them. They're just like, no, leave me alone. Give me my food and that's it, right?
They know what
Uh,
they need from you.
exactly.
I love it. I love it. That is so neat. Can I ask how many alpacas you have and how many?
Well, currently we have 6 alpacas
Oh,
and one
wow.
llama.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is quite a farm. That's pretty impressive. I love that. That's incredible. That's a
Yeah.
lot of work though too.
Yeah.
Uh, but
Yeah,
I love
definitely.
the fact that you're outdoors and doing something that contrasts from the technical. And I think that's so important for all of us, for our well-being and who we are, to have things outside of just staring at screens and data. So that's awesome. I love
Yeah,
that. I love
you
that.
have to get outside, you have to get away for a little bit. I think it helps clear your head. I mean, you can't, when you're just sitting in front of the computer all the time, after a while you start to get this brain fog. Especially if you're working on a case or something, like you get bogged down in this detail. And once you get away and you get some fresh air, things will come back to you that
Yes.
just suddenly you'll be like, oh, I could have totally done this. And then you can go back and you can apply that to whatever you were doing when you come where you left off. And it helps totally.
Giving your brain that space sometimes allows you to click and see things in different ways and get a different understanding or attack something from a different perspective, especially when you're stuck, right? And there's so many different ways to do it. Not all of us have farms. Maybe you're getting out and exercising, maybe you're reading, but something to separate from that is just awesome. And not reading a technical book on that topic, because then you're still stuck, right? Like
Yeah.
I love this concept of getting outside, doing something that's different, and giving yourself that place to clear your mind. It's
Yeah,
critical.
totally. It totally helps. I recommend it.
I love it. Recommendations for Jamie. that's that's amazing. So speaking of things that you recommend and your advice, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's looking to get started in digital forensics?
Well, I would definitely recommend looking at open source projects. When I was a student, I was so into open source. I mean, first of all, you get your hands on it, and then also you could tweak it, you could change it, you could play with it and make it your own and extend it and try to get involved with the communities, especially with the forensics communities, the open source projects. They're all very friendly. That
Absolutely.
was the thing that I wasn't sure of whenever I first started trying to get involved with volatility. I was a little bit afraid because I didn't know really anybody in the project, and it was a little bit different then also because it was like our only RC or whatever and email, and you weren't really sure like how people were going to respond back. But now we have Twitter and we have other things, and sometimes there's a face to put to it, and it's a little bit easier, I think, nowadays. But
It's not as intimidating as it was then.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's not as
100%.
intimidating. But luckily, when I was getting involved with volatility, everybody was so nice. Everybody was so helpful. They were just so like, "Oh, yes, come here. Let me show you how this works and how you can extend it and how, and that makes a big difference." So that's also advice for people that are running their open source projects. Like, be friendly to the people that
True.
are coming in. But most of the people that I know that write open source software in this space are very friendly and
Absolutely.
definitely worth talking to them. A lot of them don't mind to kind of point you in the right direction, and everybody loves to get pull requests for things, especially if it's like something like cool that you've written. Everybody likes that. So definitely get involved. It helps with your understanding. Um, in general, people have had questions about whether or not you should even know how to program if you're going into forensics, but I think you pretty much do at this point. I remember when
I
I
think
was,
back you might not have needed to, but I
yeah,
think now it's a critical skill, to be honest.
yeah,
Yes.
when I was a graduate student, I remember there were different types of students who were in the graduate program, and there were some who they were just very annoyed about having to learn computer science type classes, like where they would have to program or something like that. And they would get very annoyed about it. They were like, why can't we just run Ncase? Why can't we just run
Right.
FTK? Why can't we just hit a button and whatever? And so
But you
there were
don't
people
learn and
like that.
understand, right?
Well,
Like,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And there are things that break. I mean, I worked at guidance, and
Yes.
there were things like occasionally it would break, and if you didn't have an understanding of what the disk actually looked like, you wouldn't be able to make any sense of it. There were times like whenever, like the MF, where the MBR was like broken, and you had to like change it. Luckily, with Encase, you could change it to where the boot sector was and whatever, and it would kind of rebuild the disk after that. Um, but if you didn't know, like, how are you going to be able to make any changes? How would you be able to rebuild a RAID? All these things that were just like
The
crazy.
the
And
the rate of change almost requires it. right?
Yeah.
Like tools are fantastic. You've worked for a tool company. I work for Magnet, which creates forensics tools, and they're great for helping with the speed that we need. But things change at a rate that cannot be met. And when you have something that is that new iteration or that new change, or when something is broke, you need to be able to adapt that day. You don't always have the
Hmm.
luxury of waiting for a company to come out with that newest release. You may, and that's great, but you don't always have that luxury.
Right.
And things with the rate of change, number of applications, when things are broken, when you have a corrupt image, being able to adapt to those things is absolutely critical. And I'll tell you, I think it's changing in terms of the community. So I teach at George Mason and I have graduate students. And so that I know the expectations, every single term, um, I ask them a couple of questions on the first day, and one of them is, "What is your coding experience?" Well, it's and I make it completely okay if they don't have coding experience. That's okay because we're going to still get through it. But and this term, 100% of my students had Python. Could write Python scripts, and it was the first term where everyone checked off that they felt highly comfortable being able to write a Python script, and I was like, yes, because it completely
Awesome.
changes what we could do. I would tell you on the contrary, and I think it goes to a little difference. I asked about experience with SQLite. Zero experience with SQLite, and I used to get like 100% experience with SQLite. And again, it changed what I had to teach, right? Which
Hmm.
is important to adapt those things. But I am definitely seeing a trend with more people, I think, across more fields in general are having coding experience and skills when
Hmm.
they come into professions as a general. And I think it's a great plus up. And I think that's great advice to people who are looking to get started, is to make sure that they have some coding skills under their belt, but
Hmm.
also that involvement in open source projects will help you stretch that. And
Yeah. Because that way you're able to actually make a change in that moment, and it's something that's meaningful. Um,
yes, and,
yeah.
and you get the understanding, you're getting the connection to the community, and you're getting a resume line,
Hmm.
right? You're getting a resume line, and I think that's really really cool. And the open source community, you're right, is amazing. And there are so many different projects in almost every subsection of digital forensics where you can do that. So if there's something you're passionate about, there is an open source project related to that sector that you can dig in on. And I love that. That's
Yeah.
great
Yeah,
advice.
totally. And in addition also to actually like just creating software and being able to write your own tools and everything, I think in general, being able to program helps your analytical thinking, uh, for being able to do these kind of cases. It helps you kind of be able to see the long term and find solutions that you wouldn't normally find. So definitely,
Yes.
it's a plus. Uh, Definitely, I recommend learning how to program. Um,
And you bring up a bunch of other things there because it's not even maybe just about the parsing or the figuring out. It could be
mhm.
about the automation of the things you're
Exactly.
doing.
Hmm.
And so it could be at that higher level, or it could be about the whole mental process of how you're thinking about how data is stored. I think it's different when you know how to actually create things that get stored, if that makes sense. Like
Hmm.
you understand a little bit more about um, the way things work in a different way where you're able to apply it. So I love that. And you brought
Yeah.
up something else, which I thought is really important. You said that there was a little bit of intimidation. And I think that that is something that's very common.
Yeah.
And that encouragement to not be intimidated, to reach out, that you're right, people get excited when you reach out to them. People want to help and want to help you grow. Um, there's a big difference though between reaching out and asking your assignment question versus
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because there have more and more people are actually teaching memory forensics nowadays,
yeah.
and you kind of notice like around certain times of the semester when you start getting similar questions for things. So it does happen where people do ask questions about their homework assignments. Um, but I mean, in a way, like there sometimes like maybe there's legitimate questions that they could ask,
Absolutely.
like kind of related to that. But
Absolutely. To get deeper understanding. And maybe it means that there's lack of resources in understanding in a
mhm.
particular area. So maybe when you ask those questions, you're lighting off to somebody who thought something was fundamental and they know backwards that, oh, maybe I should write a blog about this because maybe people don't know this thing. So it is good. But, but I think I see it. I definitely get a series of questions from like 5 people at one time in a semester, and you got them 3 months before, the same questions in bulk, and you're like,
I'm starting to notice a pattern here.
we're kind of good at pattern analysis because of our jobs. So, yeah, I love that. I love that that piece of advice, though, to not be afraid to reach out, to know that to not to get over that intimidation, right? And
Yeah.
that those connections are going to help you, and to try to, and you're like a living example of that. Like what you did, oh, I'm interested in memory. Oh, there's this tool. I'm going to reach out to the author on IRC and I'm going to ask all the questions I have so I can get an understanding. And now I want to be part of this project. And now you are one of the core developers and a senior researcher for that project and foundation. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's been a long trip, but I was lucky. I was lucky that everybody was so friendly, and I can't imagine, like if Aaron and Brendan had been kind of stuck up or whatever, like it totally would have been different. But no, luckily they're all amazing people, and I really like working with them. And it's been a long trip with them.
That is so wonderful to hear. Thank you so much for sharing so much about your journey and your inspiration and your advice today. It's been such a pleasure
Oh,
getting to
thank you for
talk.
having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Be sure to join us next week. We've got a really cool schedule coming up for 2021. Next week, we'll be talking to Doug Bryan Jr. And then coming up, we have Nicole Odom, Yogesh Khatri, who has amazing open source projects, just updated his Mac APT to support iOS, Phil Moore, Jay Sasparidis, Daryl Fife, Eric Katz, Chad Tilbury, and more. So check it out. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Stop recording.